Dreaming of blissful summer days and creamy popsicles? Capture sun-drenched memories with the Orange Vanilla Dream Hydration Multiplier from Liquid IV. Just one stick and 16 ounces of water can help hydrate you better than water alone. Live your summer dream with Liquid IV. Tear, pour, live more. Go to liquidiv.com and get 20% off your first order with code INDULGE20 at checkout.
DC politicians want to enact harmful credit card mandates that could take away your cash back and rewards points. Perks that stretch your budget and make life a little easier. Losing these benefits means less money for your family's everyday essentials like gas and groceries. The perks you rely on could disappear, leaving you with higher costs and fewer options. Tell Congress to guard your card and oppose the Durbin-Marshall credit card mandates.
Paid for by Electronic Payments Coalition.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It seems like it's all we hear making the headlines. Teenagers finding themselves at the center of criminal stories, sometimes throwing rocks at moving cars, other times an armed break and enter, and even homicide investigations. More often than any news organization would like to report. When you hear the stories and find yourself asking, what's going on? Why does it seem like youth committing crime seem to be getting younger and younger, and it's happening more often? Well, you're not the only one feeling concerned or even scared. But with recent data from the federal government showing a rise in youth crime, but not in violent acts, the confusion sets in, and you're not quite sure who to believe or what to think. I'm Maria Kestane, and today on The Big Story, I'm talking to Dr. Kim Varma, a criminology professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, to discuss why we're seeing such a jump in criminal stories involving young people and how to make sense of why teens turn to crime when there's quite literally a handful of other things they should be involved with instead. Kim, thank you so much for joining me today.
Happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, full disclosure, Dr. Kim was one of my professors when I studied at TMU. And the class she taught was Youth Justice in Canada. And it was definitely one of my favorites, besides the fact that it was Dr. Kim. But it's because youth justice is such a multifaceted system that not many people really know the workings of, but many people have opinions on. So that's what I kind of want to dive into today. So let's get an overview of the system that we have here in Canada. Who are considered youth? Who controls the definitions of the crimes? And who has the jurisdiction to deal with them?
Yes, the Youth Criminal Justice Act is the legislation that we have here in Canada. It's federal legislation, which means that every young person across the country will be treated under this particular legislation, but the provinces administer the youth justice system. So in terms of who's got control, it is the provinces that run the institutions, that run the courts, that will make those decisions around youth criminality. But the legislation is federal, so it's the federal government that provides the laws that are in place that we have. And the Youth Criminal Justice Act has been in place since 2003. So I think you asked a few questions there, so I'm not sure if that sort of answers the overview.
Yeah, totally. What is or who are considered youth? What age range is that?
Yeah, so a young person in Canada is someone who's a young person in conflict with the law, would be 12 years old till 17 and 364 days. So at the age of 18, one is considered to be an adult in terms of criminal justice.
Right. So you mentioned the Youth Criminal Justice Act. That's what we have here in Canada. I know as a criminology student that has a lengthy history that had many versions of it. Can you bring us up to date? What is the YCJA and what does it kind of aim to do?
Yeah, so the Youth Criminal Justice Act, again, came in 2003. Its main aims are to try and deal with the spectrum of youth offending. There is, while we in the news hear a lot about very violent offenses, and we have, and I know we will talk about that, a lot of young people commit offenses that are more minor, more property-based offenses versus the violent offenses that we hear about in the news. And so the Youth Criminal Justice Act recognizes that. It is a developmentally appropriate approach in the sense that we recognize that young people are different from adults. Even though some will say, do the crime, do the time, just like an adult, young people are developing. And so that age group of, 6 years between 12 and 17 years old, they are not fully developed. They don't necessarily know what the consequences of some of the offenses that they're committing are. And so the Youth Criminal Justice Act tries to take a developmentally appropriate approach, recognizing they have diminished blameworthiness. And so the offenses are dealt with meaningfully in the sense that if a young person commits an offense that's very minor, like let's say shoplifting in a drugstore, shoplifting a lipstick, there needs to be a consequence, but it doesn't need to be a formal justice custody type of consequence. So this is where we have diversion for more minor kinds of offenses or theft or those kinds of things that are not as violent. For the other side of things, when it's a violent offense, this is where there is longer periods of time, intensive supervision to try and deal with what the concerns are that led a young person to commit those offenses. So I think the main aim is to recognize that youth are different from adults, that they need different responses, and to sort of divide the kinds of offenses into the seriousness and a proportionate response that makes the young person accountable and responsible.
So we know that custody and doing time behind bars is an option for a consequence. Can you tell me a little bit about other consequences or I guess outcomes that a youth offender could be subjected to if they find themselves in a run-in with the law?
Right. Yeah. So this is where that division occurs. So sometimes with, again, minor offenses, young people will be what's called diverted. And so members of the public that are listening to this might have heard of diversion. Some people see that as a slap on the wrist, but it's not necessarily. It is not formal court processing. It means it's actually called extrajudicial measures. And what it allows for is a young person to do something to repair the harm or to be accountable and responsible for what they did. So they might write an apology letter. They may provide personal services to a victim. They may compensate in some way. There are lots of different kinds of things that can be done, even programming that they can be involved in to understand the harms of what they have done. So those consequences are based upon this idea that we're trying to minimize the intervention of the justice system as much as possible so that the young person doesn't walk around with the stigma of being a criminal offender and that they have a second chance and hopefully can stay clear of the youth justice system from there. So those are a lot of responses relate to diversion for young people and community-based kinds of approaches that are not custodial.
Right. How does, in your opinion, the Canadian Youth Justice Act compare to other countries' youth justice legislation? Are we ahead of the game here in Canada or behind it?
Well, I think that's a hard one to sort of say for sure ahead or behind. I think we've done a very good job with the Youth Criminal Justice Act. We very rarely see legislation having such an impact on our statistics. And when the Youth Criminal Justice Act came in, it had an enormous impact on the number of cases that were coming into the youth justice system, in part because diversion was recognized as an appropriate way of dealing with things and police officers were encouraged to use it. And so it's a way of keeping young people accountable, but it's outside of going to formal court. So when it came in, it had this major impact. The numbers have come down over a couple of decades. And again, I know we'll probably speak about that. So in terms of how it relates to other countries, it really depends. Like if you look at the US, which is very close to us in terms of culture and media and things like that, they have very different approaches because, of course, each state has their own juvenile justice realm. And so they'll have potentially different age groups, different ways of dealing with things. Some states are seen as more punitive and focused on incarceration than others. Whereas like Scotland, for example, is much more child welfare oriented than we are and is really much more child centered in terms of the way that they deal with things. So it's a more rehabilitative child welfare orientation. We're kind of middle ground, I would say, where the Youth Criminal Justice Act is very much focused on rehabilitation. And the ages are, 12 to 17. So someone who's under 12 would be dealt with under child welfare legislation and not youth justice legislation who commits an offense. And so we're kind of middle of the road. We have restorative elements in our legislation, but rehabilitation is the main focus, and reintegration, because while people don't necessarily always think about this, every young person will come back. They'll come back to society. Sometimes we think, well, give them jail and then forget about it. But young people will all come back to society. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we want them to come back better, or do we want to, have a concern when the young person returns?
I want to talk about stats a little bit. In January of this year, Ottawa published some numbers on youth crime for 2023, saying there was a 13% increase from the previous year, which also saw an increase compared to the year before that. What's interesting about this data is that they attribute the biggest part of that increase to nonviolent crimes. For example, car thefts, fraud, break-and-enters. When you zoom out a bit, yes, compared to homicide or assault with a weapon, these crimes do seem nonviolent. But when you hear that a 14-year-old was charged with breaking into someone's home in the middle of the night, you don't necessarily feel better about that. What do you make of this year's findings?
Yeah, and I think you make a very good point, which is we can talk about statistics all we want, but there is the harm that's caused and the concerns around very young people committing serious offenses, for sure. I think, though, what comes out of the news is newsworthy, and it's usually newsworthy for a reason, which is that it's usually more anomalous, specifically younger youth and more serious offenses. While it doesn't look that way, and I understand why members of the public would feel that way, it is news because it is not the norm. What the norm is what the data is telling us. And yes, there has been an uptick in youth crime overall in the last 2 years. But then even in that same report, they do talk about the fact that over the last 2 decades, it's been decreasing. And it was decreasing when the Youth Criminal Justice Act came in, as I was mentioning before. It's not gone back to pre-pandemic levels, even though there is a rise in youth crime over the last 2 years. It's not as high as it was even before the pandemic in 2019. So the question is this a long-term trend where we're moving upwards? Is there a concern? Or is this 2 years where we need to look very carefully and understand what's actually happening here and respond appropriately?
Do you think people's outrage is justified when they say these crazy stories? Like, as a criminology professor yourself, when you hear these stories on the news, do you ever think like, oh my God, that's insane? Or do you kind of like take a step back and what kind of goes behind that story?
I think I do both, actually. Yeah, I do. When these stories come out, there's been a number of them recently, homicides that have occurred involving very young people. I am shocked, like anybody else, that it's very hard because I recognize what goes on behind the scenes in terms of the legislation and the overall statistics. But just as a human being, yeah, I'm absolutely shocked when I hear that this is occurring. And I guess the only way of understanding it is to say, okay, is this a youth crime wave, or is this a very sad situation that's occurred, but is not necessarily a trend?
I mean, it's not necessarily a natural thing for people to commit crimes, especially young people. I guess the overarching question I want to ask you is, what motivates today's youth to make these choices?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. And I think the overall is that young people commit the same kinds of offenses over time, that it doesn't really change. A lot of what young people engage in are things like mischief, low level shoplifting or low level theft. Even when it is violent crime, the statistics do say that it's usually low level violence, like common assaults or assault level 1, which could be someone shoving someone else in a playground, that kind of thing, just to use as an example. So, so I think that the reasons stay the same, which is that young people are sometimes testing the boundaries of adult life. They have some freedoms. They're not children anymore. They're out. And so this is something that happens. And so how we respond is really important. The other side of it, perhaps it has to do with some of the things that have happened in our recent past. For example, the pandemic has had an impact on young people's development. And being locked down for a couple of years for young people in middle school was probably not necessarily good for them. So that might have had an impact on what we're seeing potentially, the isolation and the lack of socialization. The other side of things might be social media. And so some people have pointed to this idea of social media and the kind of content that young people are engaging with, potentially violent content or things that are, difficult for a young person to digest. That may have some bit of an impact on why we're seeing what we're seeing.
What do you make of I guess the recent, maybe in the past 5 to 10 years, the rise in social media obviously changing the way young people engage, but I think also a lot of young people, in my opinion, do these crimes for kind of like a clickbait, kind of like to gain popularity, to it's just like an outlandish thing to gauge like a gag reaction.
Yeah, there is that too. I think, unfortunately, TikTok and Instagram and those kinds of things maybe egg young people on in a different way. There used to be peers have an impact on what young people do. They're trying to show off to peers. Now there's a new venue to show off to peers, and that comes through social media. There was a case, it was in Alberta, I believe, where a young boy was being sentenced for, it was actually assault with a weapon. And what he was doing with his friends was a TikTok thing, whatever you call those things, where they were trying to, everybody that was in this community that was young was throwing cold coffee on patrons in a Walmart parking lot. So that was the weapon, it was cold coffee, and the assault was throwing it on people. Not a nice thing to do, but he couldn't understand when the judge was sentencing him why he was being sentenced when his other friends got away with it and it was on TikTok. And so he didn't understand, he was 14 years old, I think, why he was being targeted when everybody else is doing it, out on social media. So I think there is this kind of strange psychology to this, peer-related, trying to influence others that we're sort of just learning about and trying to understand how that relates to youth offending.
A big story that much of Toronto is following is the 2022 swarming death of a homeless man, Kenneth Lee. 18 girls, ranging in the age from 13 to 16 at the time, were all charged with second-degree murder. Some of them took pleas, some went to trial. Ultimately, only one ended up going to trial, where she received a manslaughter charge. Lots to unpack here. Lots. This was a big case that unfolded over the past 3 years or so. First, though, in your opinion, what did you make of the case when it first started making headlines? What was your reaction to hearing this?
I was, again, probably like everybody else, just shocked. It's so anomalous that something like this would happen. But at the same time, it happened. And for that number of young people to be together, eight convicted young girls, being so young. I think one of them had just turned 13, in fact. And to have this happen to somebody who was vulnerable himself and who was trying to help somebody else, as I understand it, it's sadness after sadness. Like, it was just shocking to me. Again, as a criminologist who works in this area, I was quite surprised by it.
Right. When the Ontario judge rendered the manslaughter charge for the girl that went to trial, did you think that was appropriate or fair, in your opinion?
Well, not being in court, not hearing all the evidence, it's hard to be able to gauge that. But from what I understand, they weren't able to show the both planning and intention to commit this homicide. The young girl apparently had engaged in substance abuse with the other girls as well. They were drinking and doing other things that might have impacted their decision making. And so to show that they were planning this and that there was an intention, and that's the main thing, to commit this homicide was the challenge for the Crown. And as I understand it, they didn't show that. So that's why the manslaughter charge.
Right. One of the reasons none of the girls received further jail time was because when they were being held on remand, which means being held in custody ahead of trial, they were subjected to several strip searches, allegedly leaving these girls naked. Now, a few months ago, a judge ruled that it was unconstitutional and that they would factor that their time spent in custody and their strip searches into consideration while they were sentencing these girls. We're talking about a murder charge here. Yes, we're talking about this vulnerable man that was swarmed and killed. But can you tell us some of the vulnerabilities that you face while they're in the criminal justice system?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think it's actually worthwhile to back up a bit and recognize what remand is. And I think sometimes people think it's detention, so that's their punishment. At this point, a person who's on remand is not legally guilty at that point. They're legally innocent. So remand, the point of it is to detain somebody before their trial or before sentencing, or there are other reasons for holding somebody, but those are the main ones, because they don't know whether they're going to show up for their trial, or there's a concern with public safety, or there's a reason that not holding them would undermine public confidence in the justice system. Those are the reasons. It's not as punishment. So when somebody is sitting in remand, it's called dead time sometimes, because they literally are just sitting there being held. They're not serving a sentence because they have not yet been found guilty. And some of those youth will never be found guilty, and they will never get that time back. So remand is a very concerning place. And what we know from stats actually is that the use of remand is quite high for both adults and youth. And it's actually been going up in the last couple of years. So there are more young people on remand serving detention than sentence custody in our provincial jails. That's not the way things should be. It should be used as a last resort. So the vulnerability piece is really important in the strip searches that you mentioned that came out of the trial. These are concerns because these are young girls. These are people under 18. As I understand it from what I picked up from the news and from the court case, there was some misunderstanding about when somebody's being strip searched, the person being completely naked. I think that they try and give them some privacy with letting them hold a towel while they're doing this. But these are young people. They don't have their parents right there. They don't have a lawyer at the time. They're very vulnerable in this situation. And this is not their punishment. We have to remember that actually the sentence will come later if they're found guilty, which they were. And that's when they're serving their punishment, but not this. So I think it's very concerning. We need to be looking at this very carefully as to what the harms are when we're holding people in detention in such high numbers that are young, that are under 18 years old, when they don't have somebody to help them that they can call easily, that if something's happening, they're still children. So we have to remember that.
You mentioned the fact that remand and custody time should be a last resort. I want to devil's advocate that for a second, because you hear a lot of the time that these young people that commit crime after crime, they were out on bail at the time after doing another violent crime. And a lot of the rage comes from that. A lot of the rage of the public comes from, why would they be out at the time if they already, were accused of another violent crime? Why wouldn't they be held in jail? It's a very delicate dynamic. And I think criminologists have a hard time sometimes convincing the public that remand is not as useful as you think it is.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And you do hear that again in the news. So that would suggest that these are cases that are not the typical case when somebody has committed a violent offense and was out on bail. It's not to say that it doesn't happen. And no system is completely perfect. There are going to be situations where somebody was out on bail and committed another offense. But I guess the other thing is there are other ways beyond detention that we can hold somebody accountable, not accountable because this is remand, but supervise them and make sure that they do come to trial and that they are not intimidating witnesses or tampering with evidence, and that there's no concern in terms of public safety. There are other community-based ways to actually have somebody report to do things that detention does, but without the actual custodial side of things. So I think we need to engage in that as well. And I would also say that we also need to think about the harms of detention. So while people think that somebody's just sitting in a jail cell and no big deal, a young person who goes into detention, let's say they're in school, they're going to fall behind if they're in there for, let's say, 15 days. Now they come back to school and then they drop out of school potentially because they're so far behind. And then that sets the cycle off of criminal offending again. So if we want to be safe, we have to think about what those harms are as well. The other thing is detention facilities are also violent. Often a young person might get baited into a fight, might get involved in other kinds of violence. And again, they're legally innocent at that time. So we need to be very careful about what we allow to happen because we think it should be punishment, perhaps.
The Youth Criminal Justice Act offers various protections to youth, including publication bans on their names, which has some limitations of its own. Can you explain why that publication ban of an identity is in place and where there's exceptions to that?
Yeah, the publication ban is in place in order to provide that rehabilitation and reintegration back into the community. It is there because young people are supposed to get that second chance. And if we publish their names, everyone will know the stigmatization and labeling and all that comes along with it. So that's why the publication protection is there. There are certain situations where if a young person is at large or there's a concern about public safety and they're looking for a young person who's alleged to have committed an offense, that police can allow for the picture and name to be publicized for a period of time. And once that person has been apprehended or there's no concern, then they ask people not to publish the name.
Right. This could be a controversial question, but who is responsible for youth that commit crimes? Is it the government? Is it families? Is it schools? Who's responsible here?
I think we all have a responsibility. I think it's not just the justice system. And I think that's where, going back to the aims of the Youth Criminal Justice Act, when a violent or serious offense occurs in the news, people say, oh, the Youth Criminal Justice Act is to blame. It's an after-the-fact legislation. When an incident occurs, that's when it kicks in. But we need to think about prevention. We need to think about what are the other institutions and people that are part of this young person's life and understand what to do about that. So I think that's not only the justice system, but schools and social agencies and counselors and mental health professionals. There's a whole range of people that need to be involved. And the Youth Criminal Justice Act does do that. They try to provide that. But perhaps before it happens, maybe we need to think about funding and support for those kinds of facilities.
You mentioned funding and support. What kind of programs or supports do you specifically think could help keep youth in the right place?
Yeah, so I think that, again, schools a lot of times get funding that's cut. And I think after school programs to enrich the young person's life while they're there, or if they don't have anywhere to go after school and they get involved in trouble, maybe those kinds of programs might help in the period of time between that and when a parent happens to come home to provide some supervision. Employment, helping them with employment skills, job training, or other kinds of training so that they can find ways to make money. Even financial literacy, some young girls, for example, have run away from home for some legitimate reason, sometimes because there's violence in the home. And being exposed to or experiencing violence is something that does have an impact on a person and does lead sometimes to criminal offending and victimization. And so addressing intimate partner violence in the home, having support for young people that do run away, shelter systems, housing, education, training, financial literacy. Some young people, some young girls have children. They need help to try and raise those children and have a safe place to be. So on the broad level, funding for those kinds of things are really important, not just stiffening sentences, right? And I think on an individual level, again, life skills and those kinds of things are important, but also addressing substance abuse and focusing on youth strengths, finding ways to reduce the harm in their lives and helping them build their self-esteem and confidence and keeping them in school. I think it makes sense to anyone that really thinks of it in that way, but I know that when a very serious offense occurs, people get sort of retributive, and I understand that impulse, but if we really want to be safe, we need to think more broadly.
Dr. Kim Varma, a criminology professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
And that was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Maria Kestane. Thanks for listening.